Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers. The other is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly, something feels different about this recording, but I can't quite put my finger on it.
It's interesting, isn't it? We seem to be, maybe our backdrop is better than usual. More realistic Zoom background.
That's very high fidelity.
Yeah.
In case listeners and viewers are wondering, we actually live in different cities. I live in Canberra and Holly lives in Melbourne, so we're forced to record remotely. But on this occasion, we share the same point in the space-time continuum, and we are actually in Melbourne, which is pretty cool.
Indeed, at the University of Melbourne. We are.
I didn't think you were going to mention that, but yes.
I think it's fine to mention it. This background, curated, brought to you by the University of Melbourne.
Okay, now, Holly, the topic we're going to discuss today is the notion of white fragility, a notion popularized by the author and academic Robin DiAngelo, and she wrote a book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, published in 2018. And we have both read that book, I believe, for the first time. It was certainly my first time reading it.
I will confess that I listened to the book, which some people think is a worse, corrupt version of reading. So just to be upfront, I've twice listened as penance to not reading it.
Okay.
For whatever that is worth.
Holly, why don't you begin by telling me and everyone watching and listening what you understand by the term white fragility as articulated by DiAngelo?
Yeah, I've prepared for this moment.
What, your whole life?
So I can tell you, now's my time to shine, that according to DiAngelo, white fragility is triggered by the discomfort and anxiety of white people being spoken to about their racism. And it is born of, in DiAngelo's view, superiority and entitlement on racial lines. So she thinks it's a way that white people deflect racial criticism and thereby kind of maintain their privilege and entitlement. And there was a bit, like a little later in the book, she kind of sets that up in the introduction, I think it is. And then later there's a more extensive discussion. And she says that there might be an inclination to think that white fragility is a kind of defensiveness or whining, but she wants to say it's more than just that. She calls it the sociology of dominance. So we're really supposed to think about white/black in these group terms, and then think about the strategies that white people use to like retain or perpetuate their dominance. So white fragility is the kind of deflection strategy to stay where you are on the top.
Yeah. And my understanding is that this can be an involuntary or even unconscious reaction that white people have, because my understanding is that all white people, to some extent, are complicit in the white supremacist culture and the structural racism, because if for no other reason than their white fragility. And so when they just react emotionally to being told that that utterance was insensitive or racist, or you're blind to the disadvantage black people face, then you are reinforcing this whole system that oppresses black people, which is maybe why people are reacting to being told that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I don't know if this is a further point or it's just sort of part of that. She does seem really keen on insisting that you're not, what was the phrase? It's like you're not to blame. You're not a baddie necessarily, but you are responsible insofar as you and every other white person collude with white supremacy or white dominance. So it's almost like, now I've pointed it out to you that this is the group relation. You need to do everything you can as a white individual to not be colluding with other white people and not be like doing your part in keeping white people in their position. And there's various strategies about how you're supposed to do that, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe should I just flag one other thing, which is that she seems to diagnose white fragility as functioning differently between women and men. And maybe we'll want to talk more about this because it's the fun concept of white women's tears or whatever. But she sort of thinks white tears is the white women's strategy. And then she has this whole list of things that are the white men's strategy, but they don't tend to cry. They tend to do this whole list of other things. So that's interesting too, that it's not just like white fragility is not just white behavior. It's like sex differentiated white strategies or something.
Yeah. There's this kind of, to use the language of the day, there's this kind of gendered element to the way white fragility manifests.
Yes.
And so you're right, male white fragility is more kind of anger and, how dare you imply that I'm a racist, and whereas women showing their sort of emotion in relation to the oppression of black people can be, in a way, I would even say a racist act in a kind of funny way.
You say a bit more.
Well, actually, this was a point I was going to make because, as I step back and try and think about this, I think one of the things she does, which I find really interesting, but also I would say problematic for me, is she seems to be arguing against what would be, in her vocabulary, a very common instance of white fragility, which is to say, well, look, I'm not a racist because racism is violence and aggression towards people of color. It's like overt discrimination. And there are these racists over here I can point to, and I'm very different from these people. And similarly, white supremacism, well, there are these self-avowed neo-Nazis doing the Nazi salute, lovers of Hitler, people who want a white ethno-state. I'm nothing like those people. In fact, and she says this, like, I'm a progressive. She kind of implies progressives are the
worst.
The blindest to.
Agreed, yeah.
And she wants to collapse all this down so that we all become responsible for systemic racism and white supremacy. So she, in my view, expands the concept of white supremacy and racism such that it includes every single white person. That's what I thought she was.
No, I think that's right. So that maybe, I've seen this move made elsewhere, and maybe it's an uncharitable way to articulate that would be like it's a way to hang on to your claim that you were already antecedently committed to, that there is racism or there is misogyny or whatever. So it's the move from psychologizing the phenomenon to attributing the phenomenon to the system. So maybe once upon a time we thought that racism was a problem of prejudice and hatred and phobia or whatever in the mind of the white individual. Okay, but then it turns out like that you can sort of empirically investigate that, and maybe there's not that much of that anymore. And again, we'll try to keep any other group lines out of it, but you can tell that same story for misogyny or classism or whatever. Okay, so then either you have to give up the claim that there's still a lot of racism, or you have to like conceptually expand or engineer your racism concept. Okay, so that's the move, right? It's like, okay, maybe it's not about prejudice or hatred or attitudes anymore. It's about your participation in a system of white supremacy, white dominance, white socialized behaviors or whatever. And then I think it's much harder to articulate what that thing is and when you've stopped colluding in it, and maybe it's like this never ending. Now it can kind of go on forever so that the grift like begins again. But that is the move from the psychologizing to the like blaming the system and your role in it.
Interesting that you used the word grift there, and she has been accused of being what was the term?
Race hustler was Matt Walsh's
Matt Walsh, who, according to
accusation.
the internet, has recently destroyed her career. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the kind of...
So in case people don't know, there's this new film,
Yes.
Am I Racist? Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he managed to score an interview with DiAngelo, and I haven't seen it. I think you may have seen it, Holly. And, the buzz on the internet is that somehow... people love to have these clips where person X destroys person Y, but she is accused, and I wanted to actually introduce, and I'd be interested in your view, because there is a cynical take you can do here. So that strategy of expanding racism and white supremacy to the point where it does make literally all white people complicit, even if for the fact that they're just not resisting it and they're not aware of it and fighting it.
Yeah.
She is a consultant, a kind of DEI consultant, and her book is like the whole concept of white fragility seems to me to have been constructed out of her experience taking these workshops at corporations and literally talking to white people about their racism, often in the presence of coloured people. And so...
Do you mean that you think she didn't have the white fragility concept first? She just had some sense of racial equality in mind or some other sense of racism. And then from the interactions, she builds like, oh, these people are really defensive. These people deflect. Is that your sense of how things might have gone?
And, you know, I'd have to reread or re-listen to it to really get this. But I got the sense that, you know, she says she grew up in a kind of impoverished white background. I guess she didn't have a lot of contact with black people or people of colour. She became a political progressive, thought that she was not a racist. Yeah. And so there's a chicken and egg thing here. So I don't know exactly what happened, but she woke up to her own complicity in white supremacy and her own internal racism as a progressive. This is where she gets the idea that actually it's progressives who are the worst here. Yeah. I guess because people on the right are just overt racists, and we all agree to that. And so there's no question there.
That's right. She seems to think that the progressive thinks they've done the work, and that somehow makes them the most insidious.
They're because the most dangerous.
They're blaming everyone else or whatever.
Yeah. They're the ones holding back people of colour, as it turns out. Because we can dismiss, like the deplorables, they're beyond help. They're just racist. All those people that vote for
but it's weird because she doesn't say that, right? You're right that she makes this claim that like the progressives are really the worst because they don't think they need to do the work. But she doesn't ever actually address the fact that it's not like the other ones know they need to do the work. It's not like the other ones aren't ever out there having the old version of racism, like prejudiced attitudes or hatred or whatever. So it's a bit strange. She doesn't really justify the claim that the progressives are the worst. And it's not that she does, what you just said is a reason. You could say they're beyond hope. Yeah. So our only chance is to work with the press. But she didn't say that.
No, that's implicit. That's I'm inferring that to be fair. But I did get a strong sense that she discovered white fragility in herself, and through this process of talking about racism with white people. Right. Because the book is just full of anecdotes of white people reacting badly to her DEI seminars. Yeah. And so the cynical reading here is, okay, she makes a living really out of white fragility, out of the concept. So given her thesis is that white fragility is pervasive and all white people display this to some extent, and her job is to weed this out. And so therefore hire me, pay me a lot of money. I'll come in and I'll help your workforce. I'll expose the white fragility, identify it, and help you to have a harmonious workforce. I'm not saying I believe this, but I could see.
But do you mean it's like in her interests? She's like, there's big pharma and then there's like big race or whatever. It's in her interest to keep saying, oh, you'll never really be an anti-racist. Like it's a lifetime project. All this stuff is like, it's like medicalizing someone for a lifetime or whatever. Like it's a grift because it's in her interest to say, oh, actually, it's not that you could just solve it by doing a 6-month course, because then the course is finished and she's running.
I'm not saying that's, I mean, I can't psychologize her from here. All I'm saying is that I think you can see how she benefits from the theory. So it's a very self-referential, almost narcissistic method of thinking to me, because every single illustration involves her and one of her seminars, and we know from the Matt Walsh thing that she became a highly paid consultant to celebrate, like she reached the top of the DEI.
No, totally. And the book is like a bestseller. For me, the thing that's more interesting there, and this is something that you've actually mentioned yesterday or whatever, is like those anecdotes can be read another way, right? So I think this idea, like, what she's telling you, if you just take it at face value, is like, oh, white people are really like, it's really hard to talk to them about. They'll make a shitty comment about a black woman's hair. And when you, even in the most gentle way, try to explain that to them, they start crying. And it's like, maybe that's right. But another interpretation would be like, Robin DiAngelo is an extremely annoying woman who goes into the room, like makes false accusations, judges everyone, is morally righteous. Everyone gets furious, and whenever anyone tries to object or find any way to like assert their own equality, refuse to be a kind of doormat to her sense of morality, then she can just reinterpret all that as like, oh, they can't hear my wisdom. And I think that is interesting. It's like she doesn't countenance the possibility that people resisting her could be anything other than resistance to hearing about your racism. Yeah. But I just strongly suspect Robin DiAngelo is a deeply annoying woman and that I would have a defensive reaction and it would have nothing to do with race.
Well, the point, yeah, no, totally. And the interesting thing is that she is blind to this possibility.
Absolutely.
And this is the flaw with the method of doing it self-referentially in this kind of anecdotal session. So it's not a genuine sample of people because all her theory is totally justified by the reaction she gets personally. And you can't rule out the variable, as you've said, that she's just an annoying person or that the theory itself is offensive. And in her mind, I get the sense that there's, at least this is the sense you get from the book, that there's no reasonable objection to her let's face it, pretty contentious claims about white supremacism, like the culture is white supremacist. Yeah. And racism, she says, is a structure, not an event, which of course then makes everyone complicit. Yeah. And so therefore, is the reaction white fragility, or is it just she has a contentious theory and some people object, and the people objecting aren't like philosophers, and so perhaps one female in the workplace breaks down because she's genuinely hurt by the idea that she made a racist comment when she just maybe used the wrong word or something, you know?
Yeah. I guess the objection I'd want to make there is like, it's not clear to me that she just has this shoddy empirical methodology where she has these experiences in running DEI courses and then builds a theory of white fragility out of them. I think we could say she has a theory about group hierarchy and what sustains it and what history means feeding into that. And then she wants to write an accessible book, so she uses anecdotes from her own experience to illustrate the points. Yeah. And I think I don't see how we could really choose between those two. So then maybe the move is just to say, like, what do we think of the theory on its own terms, right? And I'm not going to, just because she'll call this channel switching or whatever, I'm not going to do my usual thing of wanting to read everything through my sense of gender or whatever. But I will say that the ideas in the book are not unfamiliar from other group line discussions. And indeed, it made me kind of curious how much crossover there was. Like, I almost felt that you could just rename the book Male Fragility, and if you just replaced every word white with every word male, the argument would be exactly the same, and indeed maybe more compelling, because there is gender socialization in a way that it's much less plausible that there is race socialization, even though she invoked it. So that's just to say the background theory that the book depends on, it's at least like widely accepted among academics working on race and gender and class and other identity issues like that.
So I think what you're pointing to, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, is, the underpinning theoretical framework here is like classic identity politics, right? Where your attributes, in this case skin color, have this kind of deterministic impact, and then you are everything that's glorious and horrible about the social group, you become complicit in by virtue of belonging to the group. And so therefore, because of that, as you say, this is what I heard you say, which is a very interesting idea, you can swap that identity for another one. And you can say, well, there's male fragility, because if you try to raise the issue of sexism with men, they get offended. I'm not a sexist. I'm married to a woman. I know women. Yes. I've interacted with women, and like in their mind, and this works perfectly, you can imprint it. Just like there are genuine white supremacists. I mean, there are people who rape women and beat up their wives. I'm not like that. Yeah. And so,
but do you collude in a system of patriarchy?
But then you are complicit. Yeah. The very fact you are denying your male fragility in itself is actually keeping women locked up in the kitchen and depressed. Yeah. This is what she says with black people. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know the answer to this. What does it say when a theory can be swapped out, like the content of the theory can be swapped out so perfectly for something else? That's a kind of interesting...
I was thinking about this too before our session, but I don't think it's actually undermining when it's between race and sex. Because I think we have these big three structures, race, sex, and class, and they have been historically really a basis for social hierarchy. And so I think you would expect to see some kind of familiar dynamics or whatever you would say, and maybe shared struggle in the sense that there really is like a sharing of ideas and how to articulate what the liberation struggle is. So insofar as it's just a naming of the oppressed group's situation, I don't find it particularly objectionable. The thing where I really struggled or didn't quite know what to think was her move of, it's one thing to name like African Americans and say this is an oppressed group, there's this problematic situation, they don't have the luxury of being individuals. I actually thought that was a really helpful insight in the book. Like the privileged have the advantage of being individuals, and liberal individualism, even as a theory or framework, it fits best the privilege. The people who are stereotyped and just like relentlessly assume, oh, that's just a woman, that's just a African American, that's just whatever, they are sort of homogenized in a way that denies them their freedom. But she seemed to think the solution to that was like to level down. Like we need to turn white people into a group.
We need to awaken white race consciousness.
White race consciousness, but in the sense that, now we start conceiving ourselves as a group. Maybe others start being able to stereotype us or talk about us as fragile white people. We then lose our individuality as well, but at least we're all equals now. That's the leveling down if you object to that, that's the leveling down objection. We should not aim to achieve equality for a minority group by making the people who have what you should have worse off. We should do everything we can to empower and bring up the minority group. And so I think that's where I got off board with her analysis. It was like, maybe there's a lot of things to say about the situation of African Americans in the legacy of slavery, but saying what we need to do is really like develop white identity and racial consciousness and guilt and shame. I almost think that's going to backfire spectacularly, because maybe they're guilty for 2 years, but then they get angry and they've got solidarity now as a racial group. That's so dangerous.
I totally agree. And it's interesting to me because this really goes in a different direction from Marxism, as I understand it. So the Marxist goal is not to make the bourgeoisie poor and slaving away as wage earners, right? It's to lift the working class out. And the ultimate communist utopia is one where you've got all this free time because all of your needs and wants, your material needs and wants are satisfied, and we can engage in cultural and civilizational pursuits.
Absolutely. It's so true for women's liberation. No one's saying make men worse off.
No. So the point is, Marxism doesn't turn poverty into a virtue.
Yes.
It's a recipe to escape poverty, which I can, even though I have issues with Marxism, I can respect the kind of idealistic goal there. Whereas I totally agree with you that this idea, and she's very explicit about it, that, we've got to wake up, we've got to make white people racially conscious. And I do think she's right that, I don't like this notion of white fragility, but it's true that I think white people, because I can personalize this, we often don't grow up conscious of whiteness. We're not forced to think about race in the way that racial minorities are. I totally accept that. And that's actually an important insight. And there are some insights there. But like you say, I think one reason why we are so uncomfortable, white people, talking about race is we're bloody aware of the history of Nazi Germany.
Right.
So we have this skeleton in the closet. We know what can happen.
Right.
Really, there's a real historical incident led to the death of millions of people, the absolute racist slaughter. Yeah. So I instinctively become very nervous because my mind immediately goes there. And I'm like, do I trust all the white people in my society that because she wants us to constantly think of race and everything through the lens of race. I don't want to give anything that could help neo-Nazis.
No, I agree. Yeah, and I'm trying to think, what could she even say to that? She I guess one thing already is to think that it's just a very different thing for the oppressed to gain group solidarity because that will leverage them out of oppression. That will give them the means to collective action to get out of oppression. You might still run the same argument, like, okay, but then you've got a racial group who's got a lot of solidarity and they're equal now. Maybe that's just as risky. But it does seem intuitive to me that there's something much more risky about imposing racial solidarity on an already like advantaged group, or a group that already has the equality that it should have. I have the same sense as you. It's just like an enormously risky thing to do. And maybe she's just thinking, oh no, but I only want it to do what I want it to do. Like the white, when she starts talking about on behalf of white people or we white folk or whatever, it's like, okay, you think you can control that, and it's just going to be guilt and shame about me not knowing enough about your hair or something. You can't control that. Like you absolutely can't control that.
And the danger is actually in her own anecdotes, because she says one of the common reactions she gets is, particularly white men, I think, will claim that black people have all these advantages today. So there's already this
resentment,
grievance amongst people who I don't think you could class as neo-Nazis, just your kind of middle-class people. There's already, and maybe the perception's totally wrong. Obviously it's wrong according to DiAngelo, but she is encountering this reaction against, let's just call them ordinary Americans, who say, well, there's all this reverse racism and discrimination, and people of color have all these advantages and they're always hired first over me.
Yeah.
I'm like, you really want to play with this fire? Like, and you're telling these people you need to talk about race more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they've already got this perhaps mistaken grievance, and these aren't the crazy overt neo-Nazis. I'm like the problem is I think there's all this a priori ideas. She's kind of blind to the empirical reality. She's not sensitive to what's actually happening.
What would be the more, because I was trying to think as I was reading it, like what would be the more productive way to do that? Or say I was the kind of feminist that had the impulse, like, yeah, I'm not going to focus on like women and what women need. I'm going to focus on men, like men's fragility, male tears or whatever. I mean, what's the lesson? Is it like never talk about the oppressor and what it needs to do? Just always focus your message on the oppressed and what they need for their equality? Or is it like there is a right way that you could talk about the oppressors or those that you think are colluding and keeping hierarchy in place? Is there some way to talk about them, but it's just not a group solidarity encouraging way? Or is there like, actually, no, just always focus on the positive message of what your people you're interested in need?
I can take a stab at answering that for myself, because I was thinking about this. I think, and I've heard this criticism of her work, she doesn't really offer any solutions, because what I get from the book is we're all imprisoned in white supremacy and structural racism as white people. And the tell is in her language. She talks about, right at the end, her grand conclusion is we've got to interrupt racism, like a really vague term, which kind of seems to concede we can't get rid of it, because that seems to be where the theory takes you, and we need to continue the work and the learning. So often I find left-wing ideologies always get stuck in process. There's never any end point. You see this in Australian context. So there's like Sorry Day, which will be every year in perpetuity, because you can never get to a point of actual reconciliation, or you've always got to just keep reiterating the process, because the theory doesn't actually, there's no escape valve.
You mean you can't because it's not built in when it stops? Or
well,
why?
The theory itself says you can't get out of it, right?
Oh, you mean, I see.
More or less. And so the solution is always a process. So we've got to talk about racism. There'll never be a point where we stop talking about it. Or white fragility is not something you can get rid of because it's a kind of inbuilt thing. So we've just got to, there's a perpetual process of identifying it, sort of confessing, atonement, but there's never any endpoint where there's forgiveness or reconciliation or progress. And maybe there's some truth to that. But one alternative actually is, see, if she pulled back from the overreach of the theory about white supremacy and structural racism, which I think is just too absolute and too totalizing, then I think she's right that we can and should talk about race more. And I actually think she's right because I'm happy to say I experienced this myself. I don't find it comfortable talking about whiteness for all the reasons, some of the reasons I've articulated. And like, do I wake up in the morning and think I'd really love to talk about race today with a black person? No, because I'm conscious of all the history and the like. If they want to talk
in Australia
or anywhere,
like
if they want to talk about race with me, I'm very happy. But like, I'm not going to like. I mean, this is a bit sort of silly, but it kind of illustrates the point. Do I want to walk up to an Indigenous person and say, "Oh, I'd really like to talk about race. Do you want to sit down and have a chat?" Because I immediately sense, well, I know there's all this tension because I listen to Indigenous voices, and I've got no problem with that. People. The history is pretty bleak. But anyway, to get back to my point, like the conversation's only problematic because of her underlying theory, which is guaranteed to get people's hackles up. And every time conversation you have, there's going to be resistance. Whereas if we cleared away some of that and just actually had a more open conversation about race and allowed white people to hear the perspective of black people. Because see, I'm not interested in the theory, but if a black person tells me something, I'm much more open to just accepting their experience, because it's not about objective reality and theories. I mean, if they feel like the system is working against them, they'll tell me some stories. I'm going to take that very seriously. But when a white woman gets up and says you're all white supremacists, because that is the defining characteristic of our culture, I'm going to react to that. I don't know if that makes sense. So
I can channel what the response is going to be. I mean, there's often this thought that like once you have enough of a distrust between the groups, it's really hard to have those conversations. That makes it like allyship is members of the dominant group who get it talking to other members of the dominant group. And again, it shows up in other areas that I'm more familiar with, right? So it's like, it just might be impossible if a man thinks a woman is just like emotional and hysterical or whatever, and he can't hear her try to say something that's really important to her experience, it might be that he hears that better from another man. And okay, so then there is some role. I think she's right that there is some role for white people to play if they get it. And she's probably also right that there is a level of defensiveness which makes it not easy for the person of color just to come and be like, hey, this is what's happening for me. Yeah, so then I'm not even as skeptical about the idea that there could be like, what are the white people obligations in America when it comes to race or whatever? Or in Australia, I think the conversation would be quite different. But what are the obligations here? So I'm finding it hard to put my finger on, what exactly is aggravating about it to me, because I buy more of it. It sounds like I buy more of it than you buy, but I'm still grappling with seeing her as like a cult leader, like the moral zealot who, for whatever reason, has decided like she's in position, she's a moral exemplar, like she gets it, she knows how to handle these situations. It's something about that, positioning yourself up on the top step and then teaching whites or something.
She's an enlightened guru who has escaped her white fragility. And so now she's a preacher.
But why don't I believe her? Is that my white fragility? Because I don't believe her. I just think, who are you?
This is why I say the theory is a prison, because any resistance you have, no matter how rationally, how objectively, how soberly or politely you do it, can be passed off as white fragility. So,
but wait, do you think, because now I'm thinking, what would it take for me to accept her authority? Do you think it's something about, so there are these broader like philosophical questions of when we think someone does speak for a group, right? So she invokes we white folks or whatever. She speaks about black people as though you can speak about 13% of a huge population that is. But if there was like an election or people in positions of like intellectual thought leadership in the black community in America said, Robin DiAngelo speaks for me, like she really gets it or whatever, would that change your, because I think for me that would probably change my sense of whether I'm willing to accept her view and whether I'm less suspicious of her claiming moral authority. It's something about the endorsement of the position by the minority she's claiming to be acting in allyship with or something.
Well, I'll give you an example with interactions I've had with Indigenous scholars in Australia, because obviously we're not in the American context, so it's, we're looking at that complex racial issue in America from outside, right? And this might answer your question. So, because I'm thinking in my mind, would it make a difference to me if Robin DiAngelo was black, for example? And I think it would, actually. Not that I would accept the theory, but I'd have a lot more patience and respect for it, because, I've had conversations one-on-one, and I've been in lectures, closed seminars with Indigenous scholars, and I've listened to them make really tough assessments of white Australia, make claims I just think are historically inaccurate, go into theoretical areas I think are really interesting, but like in my mind, I'm thinking this doesn't hold up epistemologically. But it just shows the different disposition. But I'm like, well, I'm a white guy in Australia. These are Indigenous men and women. So my job is not to contest, but to listen.
But I don't know why you think that answers the question about Robin's authority, because Robin is a white woman.
Yeah.
So yes, of course, like if we're in a country and members of a minority where we accept empirically their disadvantage want to speak, we should listen. I don't think we should ever defer to anyone outright because of their identity features, but I certainly think we should listen. But my question was about the white ally, or if it's sex, the male ally. Yeah. Whenever an out-group member who's part of the privileged group claims to speak for and on behalf of the minority. What is there anything you can think of where for you it would change your sense of Robin DiAngelo's authority? No. Okay.
Yeah.
I do think for me, if I saw like tweets by John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry or whatever, being like, Robin DiAngelo is right. Like Robin DiAngelo speaks for me. Like that would at least up my sense that I should take this view very seriously and like think about what she's saying is required from white people. Even though they don't speak for all African Americans, but they are like intellectual.
But they're authentic voice, African American voices, right?
Yes. But although I did just name dissident voices, and so that's probably something else to.
Indeed, but I think that's relevant because it's funny you mentioned those three figures who, of course, I like as a right-wing radical because they're all on the right in America and have a really interesting perspective, particularly on race. Although Coleman Hughes, I don't think is necessarily on the right, but Glenn Lowry definitely is. John McWhorter is a bit more complicated, but I actually watched a short clip of John McWhorter responding to DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, and he described it as the second worst book he's ever read. I think the other one was Ta-Nehisi Coates, who he has a personal beef with. Now, you're right, these are dissident voices, so they're not representative of African American sentiment.
Yeah.
But this goes to my skepticism about this white woman diagnosing the whole racial edifice in America, because again, it doesn't allow for the fact that there are actual black people who are dissenting from her view and think it's complete rubbish. Now, they may not
There'll always be dissenters though, right?
But my point is, and I guess my sin is I'm an individualist, so I think it's really...
The privilege of the white majority
which is part of white
to
supremacy.
Be an individualist.
I thought that was a really interesting idea. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
And John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, they're kind of in this, judge each person by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But again, what does she do with the African Americans who say, no, we don't live in a white supremacist culture. It exists, but it's a minority. It's a smaller problem. And yes, racism exists. I'm sure there's no black person in America that hasn't encountered it one-on-one, but they question this idea that the entire structure is. So she's not even...
But I don't think we can hang our hat... No, I think that's too strong. I mean, you can't hang your hat on like whether any one member of a huge group disagrees. It doesn't matter how smart they are.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always going to be disagreement. There's always going to be like different interpretations when you're a minority group, like of your position and what your liberation. Look at there's 20 different feminisms ideologically. Yeah. Like we're just never going to agree.
Yeah.
And so it can't be like, well, one counterexample throws the whole thing out.
Yeah.
I would want to know, and maybe this is just, I don't know enough. I'm not following the left-wing black intellectuals. And if I was, I would see that DiAngelo gets a lot of endorsement and uptake. And I think that should mean something, even if what it reveals is that this is a left-right polarized issue in America. Like the left, African-American leftist intellectuals and thought leaders do think the DiAngelo approach is right and consider her a tremendous ally. That'll be, I would want to know that, even though then I would think, well, in left-right terms, I'm probably not with the American left at the moment. That's news as well. But yeah, so this is just something I want to think about more and haven't thought about enough. Like, but it's when someone speaks for a group, like what does it take to grant them the authority that they claim for themselves? And there are so many grifters that you have to be a bit skeptical. Yeah. And I just don't know whether Robin DiAngelo is one or isn't one.
Yeah. At this point, I think what I might do is just lay out my actual, I just want to qualify my take so far, because I do want to give her due. And I want to hear your kind of overall assessment, particularly on the empirical question of these claims about white supremacy and racism. So let me start on a point I've already made, that I think she's right, that white people are uncomfortable talking about race. We don't have a strong race consciousness, and that's probably a luxury. That's part of our privilege. I can accept that. I think we do have to talk about it or find a way to talk about it, because if white people don't talk about it, then I think we can be blind to the more subtle forms that prejudice can take. So I understand all that. And I don't actually dispute the anecdotes, even if she feeds it somewhat through her personality in a way that's neither hither nor thither. You know, white people do respond negatively to the idea that they might be racist, and we have to be open to the fact that they might be in ways that they don't see or understand. And I also acknowledge white supremacy exists clearly, and racism exists. I'm open to some level of institutional racism, but the theory just goes way too far. And when we come to the white tears part, which we'll come to soon, she takes it to what I would regard as absurd and counterproductive levels. Now that's my general assessment, trying to be charitable and give her due where I think she's talking about real phenomena, real problems, real challenges. I just think she drives up to the cliff, slams on the accelerator, and just flies off it into like crazy ideological land.
So can you fill that in terms of content? Like where is it? What other claims?
Well, I just don't think you can empirically describe our society as a white supremacy culture. And I don't...
American society.
Yeah. Well, she does imply that it's all kind of... I think she would include settler colonial countries like Australia. But yes, she's focusing on America, and also the idea that every structure is racist. And
she does talk... She has this list of stats, which I did note, just because I'm thinking she could invoke some of this to say why she's describing it as white supremacist. So she has this... I won't do all of them, but it's like in chapter 2, which books we read, the people who decide that it's 90% white, which news is covered, 85% white, the teachers, 82% white, full-time college professors, 84% white, so on and so on. And again, the rejoinder to that, I looked up what is the percentage of the United States population, and it was 13.6. African-American and non-Hispanic black. So anything that's like 85% or less is proportionate. Okay, but there are still the higher figures in the 90s and the high, like when she talks about positions in Congress and so on. So then that suggests there is some problem. And if that's systematic, like I think we know that African-Americans are overrepresented in the service sectors, for example, and that does have a mirroring to the past. So I think she can invoke stuff like that to say, like, if there are these systematic things, and maybe they show up in like housing and employment, and I just don't know enough about the empirical, but then maybe you can say that's a white supremacist society in the sense that like it's preserving racial lines, or it's making it more likely that a little black kid is going to end up inheriting the position of the parents than a whatever.
In some ways, the language is the problem here. She's chosen language that is guaranteed to get to resistance, which then obscures the real underlying phenomena that you want to talk about. And that's because she takes something everyone agrees exists. I don't think anyone will say there are no white supremacists in America, right? No white person's going to say that.
But you think that means the psychology?
By extending that concept to include a white woman crying in the presence of black people in certain contexts.
But you're saying you think
it's guaranteed to make people...
You think the folk concept that everyone agrees exists is the psychology concept, the prejudice and the hatred. When you say no one denies that white supremacy exists, are you invoking the psychology version of the racism that she's rejecting and saying there's a system?
No, I'm just talking about like as a sociological phenomenon. We know there are people who are, their whole ideology is racism.
But racism understood in the psychology way that she's rejecting.
Yes. The way that actually keeps black people. But my point is, if you just imagine her coming into a context, right? The pre-context before she comes up with White Fragility, starts doing her thing, is everyone already understands there's this thing called white supremacy, and everyone accepts that there is racism. So, and people know the history, lynching, all this stuff. And she's explicit about this. She understands the challenge, that it's got such negative connotations, and people immediately think of the worst human beings who exemplify that. Her job is to convince people, no, actually, it's a much wider phenomenon. It's not limited to the worst offenders. You can't dissociate yourself as a white person from the neo-Nazis marching or the people who lynched black people in the past, because she's got this structural group identity socialization model. And I'm saying if she found other vocabulary, she might find a more open reception. But what she's constantly combating is the association between the white woman crying with white supremacists who are like neo-Nazis who love Nazi paraphernalia. So my point is, by taking these words, and I think she's very conscious of this, which have these are the worst, like racism, white supremacists. These are the worst slurs you can call a white person, right? Because most people don't want to be white supremacists or racist. And by enveloping all of us in it, and I'm saying she might be right that we've got to look at these more subtle forms, but the terms have such negative associations. Of course, white people are going to react to it.
Yeah, okay. No, I see the point that she's sort of trading on the emotional valence of those terms, and that is going to make people a lot less likely to accept. I mean, it's sort of strange because if she wins the conceptual engineering war, then everyone just feels way less bad about being called a racist, which has happened with transphobia, right? It's like at the beginning, everyone was like, oh my God, I'm not a transphobe. Please. And now everyone's like, yeah, I'm a fucking transphobe, because what does that mean? It means believing in women. Like women exist or something. So there could be that move. Like she's initially trading on the emotional shock of it, but in 2 years when everyone's read the book and talked about it, she even got to that, I'm racist. Yeah, we should be, I'm unavoidably... So now everyone's fine with being called that. They'll just say, oh, yes, we all are, and that's unavoidable, but I am doing my best not to collude. I gave $20 today to the something fund. So then the valence is destroyed pretty quickly once you get the broader concept.
You know what it becomes like? Acknowledgement to country. So everyone does it. And once everyone does it in every single meeting, it kind of devalues its significance, and it just becomes like an empty liturgy that people say. And so we could get to a point where, like, before every meeting, someone says, hi, I'm Holly Lawford-Smith, I'm a racist. I'd like to acknowledge the... And, like, in a way, it ends up becoming quite superficial. I totally agree that there is that risk. Holly, we've talked about white tears for a couple of times, and I am genuinely dying to hear your take on this, because this does intersect with feminism, it seems to me, and we alluded, or did more than allude, to the kind of weird gender equality or sex-based difference when it comes to the way men and women respond to white fragility. Just for the sake of those who haven't read the book, this comes from an anecdote. I don't think she came up with the term white tears, but after a black death at a place she worked, she organised a kind of lunchtime support group for people in the workplace to come and, I guess, talk about or console each other over this tragedy. And a black woman approached her ahead of it and said, look, I really can't handle more white women's tears right now. And she said, don't worry, leave it to me. She's the DEI queen. So at the start of the session, she informed the white women that could you please, if you're feeling a kind of upwelling of emotion, please don't cry. If you need to leave the room, that's fine. I'll come and support you. But please, and this is the key
Go to the
kicker for
crying
me,
room.
Don't cry in the presence of mixed race company. I just found this a really extraordinary but interesting
I mean, let's
instance.
explain her reason, right? Like her reason is that when white women cry, they draw the resources of the room
They become
into
the
like
attention.
emotionally comforting them. And that is a way of distracting from the real conversation that should be had. And especially like if the white woman says something that's genuinely racially offensive, people are not comforting the victim of the statement. They're comforting the white woman who's upset about being called out about it. And so far, I mean, that's not crazy, right? Like I'm sure we've all had annoying friends or ex-boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever who cry when you try to challenge them about something, or a little sister. You know, it's not an unfamiliar deflection strategy that people cry when they're challenged and that other people comfort them. And I guess it sort of fits with her theory of like white solidarity, that will, like those natural bonds between people will lead to the empathy and the comforting instead of the focusing on the racial issue. So I don't know if I was as incensed. I kind of had the vague vibe in the book that her constant sort of reference to and pointing to white women was a little bit like sexist and self-hating. There's a sense of like when a white woman chooses to make herself the oppressor and focus on her complicity and never, ever, ever speak about the fact that she's also a woman. And so she is in the oppressed or disadvantaged position at least some of the time. And that just showed up for me so many times throughout the book. Like it's a conscious choice she's making. And even when the stats I mentioned, she names like whatever percentage of teachers are white or whatever percentage of people direct the films that make the highest grossing. She doesn't say white men. She says white people, as though it's all whites versus blacks. But it's white men in most of the cases. And so she is making this conscious choice to like never, ever even acknowledge that there are other dimensions of oppression that can matter. And indeed, at several points in the book, she names that thing as people, she calls it channel switching. But it's like if anyone ever tries to say, oh, I think the real problem actually is gender or the real problem actually is class or whatever, she sees that as a changing of the real subject, which should be race. And again, like maybe you can make the case that in America, the real subject is race. And so it just means the book doesn't apply as well to other contexts. Like maybe Afghanistan doesn't need that book. So.
I'll tell you why I reacted to it. And you can tell me if you think I'm nuts. Well, I know you think I'm nuts, but we can, in specifically why. So what I found remarkable about this is like crying is an emotional expression. It's often involuntary, right? And prima facie, to be moved by a tragedy of someone who's not part of your race could be taken as a kind of act of solidarity.
Could be.
Now, I totally understand why the black woman was like, I don't want to go to a group and listen to all these white women wail about how tragic this is when they're kind of removed from the situation, whereas like that black woman might actually have relatives who were shot by cops or killed in gun violence or whatever. But I was thinking about this in terms of what we discussed earlier, like how do you actually get out of the situation if we all acknowledge, and I acknowledge to some extent that there is a problem here, if we have to go right down to the micro thing of the way people display their emotions in the presence of black people. That seems to come down to a level of micromanagement that I just don't see as tenable. Like, because if you extend that logic, then you have to second guess every word that comes out of your mouth, every look, the way you interact. And I'm not sure that's helpful to get white people to become so obsessed with
I'm not
the
really
way they're
buying this
interacting.
because I think this is what the people who complain about PC culture always say, right? It's like, oh, now I have to watch my language or whatever. It's like, yeah, maybe if you are an asshole, you have to watch yourself. Like that's part of the project of like us all getting comfortable and getting to a point where we're treating each other properly. So I don't know. I just think if there is this strategy where people want to avoid being challenged by crying, if that's true empirically, that it's not an act of solidarity and it is often just like a refusal or a deflection, I don't see it as that objectionable to be like, hey, if you need to cry, just to minimize all the crying that goes on, if you need to cry, go to the crying room and come back when you're ready.
Yeah.
And for anyone who's interested, the Matt Walsh film does have a DEI group scene where the black facilitator says, if you need to cry, go to the crying room. And Matt Walsh goes there for a little while.
Look, I think this is probably just like, this is an alien world for me. I'm not in this space, and I would never, like, if we went to I could never bring myself to go to somewhere that had like a crying room. I just find that, I mean, if people want to do it, that's fine by me. But I just, I recall at that very notion of trying to organize our emotional reactions that way. But if it works for people, that's fine. But this is where I am.
You don't object to restraint, right? You don't object to, I'm not supposed to say the N word anymore. Oh, you're micromanaging my language. So why the emotions is such a point of...
I just think it's like, where does this end? It's like, first it's like, don't cry in front of people. Then it's like, don't twitch your eye. And look, I'm being facetious. People say I'm being ridiculous, but we have seen some cultural change over the last 30 years. And for me, the theory doesn't put a natural boundary on any of this stuff, and that the DEI expert can always find some new hidden microaggression that we didn't know, and before you know it, there's a new word we can't say, or it's not just crying now, it's like crossing your arms because it looks aggressive and confrontational or whatever. I just think at some point you have to just treat people as adults. I'm not saying like anything goes, I don't believe in saying the N word. Like, there's no need to say it, it's offensive. I don't think there's anything to think like, I'm a free speech warrior because I can say it. I'm very happy with, I'm not against boundaries for the sake of being able to relate to people. I just fear that there's this zero-sum struggle and we just keep adding newer layers. And I just think there needs to be a certain freedom for people to actually relate and sort out their relationships. But again, see, I'm coming from a point of view where individual temperament, experience, ideas matters, whereas it doesn't for the DiAngelo view. In fact, that's part of the white supremacy that is a white imposition on people.
Look, I'd love to keep arguing, but we are running out of time.
We are, Holly. Thank you very much for the conversation. There's no
and you?
Better ending than an abrupt ending. Shout out to Jerome and Isaiah for doing the camera work for us. If you enjoyed this episode, where am I looking? I'm going to look into the camera now. Yes, Jerome's pointing at the camera. Thank you, Jerome. If you enjoyed this episode and you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe, drop a like, drop a comment. If you want to get involved in the conversation, if you're listening on a podcast, please follow and give a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify if that's where you listen. Whatever happens, we're grateful for your attention, and Holly and I will be back again soon. Catch you later.